Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine, war update extra. No, this is probably the Geopolitics news video for today. It's going to take the place of it because I'm just going to go on a geopolitical rant. I woke up this morning and I should have been happy. England beat the Netherlands in the Euro 2024 football semi-finals to reach the finals with Spain. Dodgy penalty decision, but we were the better team. Yeah, woohoo. I should be happy. I woke up deeply angry and pretty depressed and somewhat worried about the future of the world, and it's definitely playing on me right now. So let me try and express myself as cogently as I can and see if I can string my thoughts together, because this will be, as ever, a stream of consciousness. We are not so much going to hell in a handcart. We're going to the apocalypse in a Tesla. And I think Viktor Orban's driving, Trump riding shotgun. We've got Kim Jong-un in the back with Xi Jinping, and they're laughing, and I feel like I'm locked in the boot screaming for the car to stop, but Elon Musk has rigged it so it can't stop, and it's just hurtling towards an existential crisis. So we start, I guess, with what Russia are thinking in terms of the former Prime Minister and President Dmitry Medvedev, who says, and this is on the back of or during the NATO summit, where it has been declared that Ukraine is on an irreversible path to join NATO. But I was really hoping for NATO to be this very strong repudiation of the Russian and Chinese threat. And it's been somewhat robust in some of the rhetoric and fairly okay with some of the pledges. But when you've got John Kirby this morning, when asked directly what he thinks about ATACMS being used to strike airfields behind the Russian border in light of a hospital being targeted and destroyed, he's still banging on about anti-escalation. And yes, conversations are open, but he seems to be towing the anti-escalation party line. And it's really depressing that we are, I don't think, being strong enough. I don't think are realizing the magnitude of our vulnerabilities and the threat. So Medvedev here says the conclusion is obvious. We must do everything so that Ukraine's irreversible path to NATO ends with either the disappearance of Ukraine or the disappearance of NATO, and better still, both. So we have, sanctioned by the Kremlin, no doubt, a prominent Russian politician advocating for the eradication of both NATO and Ukraine. So that is the backdrop to where we are. Now, what I'm going to say isn't so much a criticism of a particular political party, say the Republicans in the US. Please do not interpret it as that. I am going to come down hard on maybe one or two individuals who might happen to be in that party, but they don't necessarily represent republicanism. So a bit of psychology first here. For example, let's start by saying, look, Senator Mitch McConnell, Majority Speaker for the Republicans, is absolutely on point. Slow aid to Ukraine did not restrain the escalation but lengthened the war. And yes, 7 months of congressional impasse didn't help, and I think the Republicans are largely responsible for that. But in terms of, you know, where the US goes with regard to Russia, there is a very strong advocacy here for arming Ukraine and giving them permission with as much as possible to do as much as possible to repel the Russians. This is good rhetoric from McConnell. McConnell has positioned himself absolutely correctly. This is a sort of republicanism that I would have expected, but it's not quite what we're getting from some quarters, and those quarters are the people who are going to be ruling the country if Trump wins the election. And we're going to come on to some insanely disturbing news. Just insanely disturbing news going forward. But before I do that, let's just get some psychology out of the way. So if you see Trump as your guy, he's representing your party in the elections coming up, and he might have views on things that you really, really agree with. Ukraine is a different matter. Now, either he's your guy completely and you love Trump, or he's not your guy but you love your Republican Party. In which case you hold your nose and accept a Trump presidency. Both those people will be faced with taking on board something that Trump is saying today that is deeply disturbing. And you have one of two things to do. One is you admit that what he's saying is really, really wrong and problematic. In which case you have to do some serious cognitive dissonance reduction. So cognitive dissonance, where you have the belief that either Trump or my party is perfect, and then there's evidence against that, something Trump says. And if you reject that evidence, that's a harder thing to do. And how do you keep your core belief that everything that my party says and does is awesome, and Trump is going to be our nominee? Either he's perfect or he's the best man for the job. You have to deal with this evidence. So if you admit that this is problematic evidence, then your position becomes complicated and you have to slightly undo some of your core belief. And this is really difficult to marry those two things together. But that's what I would hope you would do, more than what most of you will do. Will be try to justify this evidence as being the right thing for Trump to have said, the right thing to be. That's correct. He's good. What he said is good. Now the problem is had Trump said the exact opposite to that, you would be arguing that as well. In other words, this is not about the content. This is about the person. And as soon as that's the case, you've got a problem. For example, I am critical of Biden at the moment and think he should drop out. I think actually he probably will drop out post-NATO. So what I've thought for the last week is that he's been talking about NATO quite a few times as if that's really important, but it's not important to the electors that he's appealing to. So when he says who else is going to be, doing this with NATO, who else is going to be, like, they don't care about that. Like the average voter in the US doesn't care about how you drive NATO forward. So for me, that's what's so important in his head. And I think come the end of the NATO summit, you will probably see Biden step aside, at least hopefully, because for me, it's not about the person. It's about the ideas. So Biden, whatever, it's which party do you get elected to give you the best ideas? And I'm so concerned with Ukraine that it's all about Ukraine. And it's all about, actually, it's more than Ukraine. It's all about the global geopolitics. And at the moment, Trumpism is the worst thing for global geopolitics. And we'll come on to speak about exactly why that is in a second. But that psychological situation is so important. How do you react to what is going to be communicated to you? Do you automatically say, well, Trump said this, therefore I have to justify this as being the right thing, even though you would have done the opposite? You would have done the same to the opposite claim. And if it is problematic, how are you going to deal with that? Okay. So anyway, back to this. So McConnell was on point. And as Kasparov says, Gary Kasparov, literally no one actually believes the escalation myth. It's an excuse for cowardice, a way to avoid decisions, and also to kill Ukrainian civilians. You cannot end Russia's war of aggression without winning it. Delaying Ukrainian victory simply extends the war. Absolutely right. And here we have Matthew Light talking about his experiences in, he's the Associate Professor of Criminology and European Studies at the University of Toronto in Eastern Europe. So, having recently spent a few weeks in Poland and Estonia, I formed the impression that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has transformed neighbouring countries in ways that US and Western governments completely failed to grasp. 2 years of the war have radically reshaped expectations. From the Estonian colleague who calmly told me there will be a Russian NATO war in the next few years in which Estonia will be partially or completely destroyed, to the Polish mother who no longer wants her son to pursue a military career. People are drawing conclusions, and they are concluding that NATO is feckless and cannot or will not deter Russia. They are questioning whether their own institutions and allies are up to the challenges confronting them, and they are factoring likelihood of war into their own life plans in ways that shocked me. I mention this because the US and NATO seem to assume that as long as the invasion of Ukraine is contained to Ukraine and Russia is not actively invading other regional countries, whatever happens in Ukraine, such as destruction of a children's hospital, stays in Ukraine. Washington, Brussels and Berlin have all the time in the world to manage the invasion. If it is eventually resolved to their satisfaction, what happened in the interim, the death and destruction, the blighted lives and hopes, won't matter so much to anyone except Ukraine. They are sadly mistaken. Yes, Ukraine and its people are bearing the brunt of Russia's invasion of Europe, but even if the invasion should end tomorrow, the reputational damage to NATO and I dare say the EU has been huge. They're being exposed as inept and compromised. Do Biden, Schultz et al. Think that allowing Russia to ravage Ukraine with impunity will work out well for the Euro-Atlantic institutions that undergird their own power and prestige? People in CEE countries see their supposed allies allowing neighbour Ukraine to be annihilated. People in CEE countries are not fools or passive victims. They see what is being allowed to happen to their neighbour and update their own values accordingly. This is one reason among many why the delay in achieving Ukrainian victory is so damaging to the collective West. It's already too late for honour or conscience, but self-interest alone should lead us in the West to help Ukraine expel Russia from its territory sooner rather than later. The credibility of our alliance is ebbing away. Ukraine must win soon to salvage what's left of it. Okay, there is a burning need to get this resolved as soon as possible, but really robustly for Ukraine so that they win. Rather than what appears to be happening with the weak Biden administration, and certainly with regard to a compromised Trumpian approach to Putin appeasement, which is absolutely terrible. And we can see that develop even more, as I will tell you in a second. Now, NATO on Wednesday accused Beijing of becoming, a decisive enabler of Russia's war against Ukraine and demanded that it halt shipments of weapons components and other technology critical to rebuilding of the Russian military. So now NATO has very explicitly said China is in on this. We have, as we know, a close relationship between Russia and China. It's a matter of convenience. They aren't exactly, naturally best mates, but Russia has become a vassal state of China, and China is looking at what's taking place in Ukraine to inform how it approaches Taiwan. More on that later as some more bad news comes out concerning that. Now, where am I going with this? Well, it kind of, I say starts because I've already been going on too long, right? Starts with Orban. He has gone from Kiev and meeting Zelensky to talk about a, scare quotes, peace plan that we know is not a peace plan, because he went straight from Kiev to Moscow to meet with Putin and straight from Moscow to Beijing to meet with Xi Jinping. To, one presumes, offload information about Zelensky to those two dictators under whose influence he is. More on that in a second. Then where does he go from Beijing? He goes to the US, to the NATO summit. Where does he go from there? More on that in a second. EU members have blasted Orban over rogue diplomacy, but they've pitched no ways to rein him in, media reports. EU ambassadors lambasted Hungary during a meeting in Brussels on July the 10th over the Hungarian Prime Minister's so-called peace mission that included visits to Russia and China, undisclosed European diplomats told the media. They are not happy with him, as rightly is the case, should be the case, and yet they appear powerless to do anything about it. We are hearing that while the Russian propaganda machine has half of the GOP convinced that Hungarian kleptocrat Orban is a representative of, quote, Christian conservative values, he sold his country to Russia, China and Iran for his massive daily hamburger allowance. Orban serves only Putin. So, before we get on to Orban's next stop, let's just remind ourselves that Hungary is under the influence of Russia and China, very explicitly so. And Viktor Orban is the darling of the conservative movement in America, CPAC. The Conservative Conference has been in Budapest twice, is it? Orban has featured at it a number of times. They absolutely love Orban, and Trump welcomed Orban to Mar-a-Lago recently, even though he refused to go to Kiev and meet Zelensky, saying that wasn't the right thing to do for someone who wasn't head of state. And then literally the next week had, as if he was head of state, the red carpet laid out for Orban to come to Mar-a-Lago with the flags there that made it look like it was the White House, and took in the head of state of another country, even though he had just refused to meet Zelensky on the basis that would not be right for someone who isn't head of state. So Orban is super. You had the rhetoric of Trump there saying Orban's amazing, though that obsequious kind of fawning over Orban and saying he's the greatest European leader, etc., etc. They don't like him so much over there, but he's the greatest European leader. So we know where Trump's sympathies lie. We know that he, in 2018, wasn't it, in the Helsinki press conference, which I think was the worst Trump moment of his entire presidency, where he put Putin over his own intelligence services and basically sold his own country down the river. So much so that Republicans themselves had a go at him, and and the day after he had to come out and apologise and row it all back. Well, not apologise, because he doesn't do that. So we know he loves Putin. He's fawning language over Putin, fawning language over Orban, fawning language over Xi Jinping and Kim Jong-un, from whom he's received a love letter and talks fondly about that letter and wanted to keep it in the documents that he kept hold of. So we know that he likes dictators because he kind of wants to be a dictator himself. We know the immunity changes in the Supreme Court and the stacking the Supreme Court and the Project 2025 would move a US administration towards a more authoritarian situation, whereby there are no checks and balances to a Trump administration, because he would control the judiciary, the FBI, right down the FBI and the CIA, and all these people would be loyal right down the hierarchy. And he loves himself some Orban. Orban represents, conservative Christian values. It plays well with the American audience of a certain sort. Well, we now know that Hungary is very much involved with the Belt and Road Initiative of China. There are Chinese policemen involved in policing the streets of Hungary. There's a new cooperation has been signed agreement between Hungary and Iran. This is a member state of the EU and a member state of NATO, and Orban is doing all this. So this is super worrying. Okay, if you criticise China, don't go to Hungary. So this is some news out today. Orban's just signed an agreement with China, of course he's just been there, wherein Hungary will hand over anyone that China's government accuses of a crime, and now Chinese police will patrol Hungary's streets. Orban is selling the country to Russia, China and Iran. And there's a news piece here. Hungary's extradition treaty with Beijing, EU j'accuse. The EU is reaping what it sowed with Hungary's signing of a bilateral extradition treaty with Beijing and yet more Chinese joint police patrols on European soil. While the inherent danger such agreements pose to the fundamental freedoms the European Union is legally bound to uphold has become increasingly clear over the past years, the EU's capitals have largely chosen to stick their heads in the sand as to not anger China. So, the jigsaw puzzle is being pieced together. What's the next piece of the jigsaw puzzle? Orban will meet Trump at his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida after the NATO summit, Bloomberg has quoted sources as saying. Do you remember me saying very clearly that the reason he was going from Kiev to Moscow to Beijing was so that he can feed all that information back to Trump? Do you remember me saying that? Because that's freaking exactly what is happening. Orban gets in a taxi straight from the NATO summit and stops off at Mar-a-Lago to divulge all of that information that he has gathered on those 3 trips to Trump himself. Quote, the visit is likely to heighten fears, yes, that the Hungarian leader is working as an intermediary between Putin and Trump, the publication notes. Previously, Orban has already visited Kiev, Moscow, and Beijing as part of his, scare quotes, peace mission. Don't for a second think that Trump is using this information to go strong on Ukraine and defend Ukraine to the hilt. Don't for a second think this is anything other than Trump being able to use this information to force an appeasement agenda so that he capitulates America to Russia and China. Don't for a second think that ain't the case. The Kiev Independent reports Orban to meet Trump in Florida after NATO summit. Time reports. Hungarian Prime Minister Orban will meet with Trump on July the 12th. Time reported, citing unnamed sources familiar with the matter. Orban may travel to Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida, where allies affirmed from the NATO summit, where allies affirmed Ukraine's irreversible path towards membership, as well as $43 billion in funding for next year. Prior to that, the Hungarian leader visited Ukraine, Russia, and China on his peace mission. During his visit to Kiev, Zelensky rejected Orban's ceasefire proposal. Orban has a long-standing relationship with conservatives in the US and is the only European leader who is openly friendly toward the Kremlin. He has spoken highly of Trump on several occasions since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, praising him as a man of peace. The Republican Party's presumptive presidential nominee has repeatedly said he could end Russia's war with the EU within 24 hours if elected president. He's actually said he could do it before he was president, without specifying the steps for reaching a peace deal between Kiev and Moscow. Trump did not ask Orban to lay the groundwork for a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, one of the sources told Time, calling the visit more informal. The Hungarian Prime Minister said in March that Trump would stop funding Ukraine if elected. So Orban, after his previous meeting, said Trump would stop funding Ukraine. So again, core belief, information. What do you do with that information? You either say, that's a lie, that's not what he said, or that's the right thing to have said. Very few of you who are big Trump fans or big Republican fans will go, yeah, that's proper wrong. And although I like Trump, and although I like the Republican Party, that is wrong. And I need to deal with that by being honest with myself to say that is the wrong approach. The Hungarian Prime Minister said in March that Trump would stop funding Ukraine if elected. The former US president has long criticized US aid to Ukraine and is, as a presumptive Republican nominee of the 2024 US elections, his sway over the party had contributed to the months-long deadlock in Congress over US aid to Ukraine. But I just want to tell you, it gets worse. So the main piece of news, there are two main pieces of news. That one, that Orban's going to Mar-a-Lago to get cozy with Trump and form some cabal that involves all the worst people on earth in the political sphere. And then we hear this, and it all makes sense. Phillips O'Brien says, European leaders do not seem to fully grasp that the North American alliance structure could be functionally over in just a few months. The enormity of it might be too much for them, but they need to wake up soon. What is this news? Trump is considering cutting back intelligence sharing with Europe, officials warn. And that's a Politico article, to which Mark Polymeropoulos says, here's a slogan, making America less safe. Intelligence liaison with Europe is a two-way street. It's enormously beneficial to the US. On hard targets like Russia, CTC, PCI, thing is Trump team telling us exactly what they're going to do. And it's absolutely nuts. Alexander Clarkson says, another of many examples where Quincyite restrainers and MAGA isolationists seem unable to comprehend that this kind of reduction or cooperation from close alliance to transactional deal making has an impact on the US as much as the European side of the equation. So while you might be the sort of person that says, oh, Europe are crap at doing this, Europe have been free riding, Europe at this, America's amazing and we're all blah, blah, blah. And the US has been paying way more for NATO, which is a problem in itself because it doesn't quite understand how NATO works. The reality is that Europe have actually funded more support for Ukraine than the US has. Despite what Trump will tell you, that is false because he lies, because everything that comes out of his mouth is a lie. Apart from, I think, when he shares his desires, his intentions, that's when he doesn't lie. And that's when you realize what's really going on here. Trump is considering cutting back intelligence sharing with Europe. Donald Trump is considering plans to reduce the sharing of US intelligence with members of NATO, which depends on the US for the type of information that has helped Ukraine fend off Russia, according to foreign officials informed of the plans. Trump's advisors have told allied countries the reduced intelligence sharing would be part of a broader plan to scale back US support and cooperation with the 32-nation alliance, according to 3 European officials and a senior NATO official who were granted anonymity to discuss internal discussions. Now, we already know 100% that Trump wanted to take the US out of NATO, or was making those moves, as has been documented from the NATO summit from, was it 2018? So the first one was in 2017, and he was a bit quieter there, a bit more demure, and then 2018 he came out and was like, no, I want us out unless you pay more. But of course, yeah, okay, there were these movements to pay slightly more, but in reality the war came along and that's what pumped up people's spending on defences, on their defence. But his intentions are, he's so microtransactional, he doesn't understand the value of alliances and the return on investment a larger alliance gets you. He looks at simple, like, we pay this much, you pay that much, we're paying more than you, screw you. That's it. That's all I need to consider. I don't need to consider the overarching benefits. That is still a benefit to the US. Like, even if the US pays a whole host of extra money, whole lot of extra money towards NATO or towards their own defence than European nations, that will still garner return on investments in terms of trade deals and intelligence sharing and influence around the world. You step out of that, you go isolationist, man, this is like Limburg in the 1930s. This is insanely dangerous. The officials said they learned about the proposal to curb intelligence sharing during discussions with Trump advisors about broader plans to reduce US involvement with NATO. The former president repeatedly questioned and sought to undercut the alliance during his first term in office. The curtailment of intel could have dire security consequences, especially for Ukraine as it tries to repel the Russian invasion. Quote, it's the American intelligence that helped convince a lot of NATO countries that Putin was resolved to invade Ukraine, one European official said. So if you remember, at the beginning of the war, it was only the US and UK intelligence services who predicted that the invasion would happen. Other people were denying it. Some countries didn't believe Russia had the capabilities to carry out a successful military campaign. Well, actually, they didn't really, but nonetheless. Asked for comment, a spokesperson from the Trump campaign did not respond directly, instead referring to a statement on Truth Social that the former president, quote, will restore peace and rebuild American strength and deterrence on the world stage. Of course, I just get so tired of these mere assertions. Like, unless you give some idea of how you're going to do that, it's not worth the time it takes me to read it. It's just BS. Just stop it. It's childish. Be the grown-up in the room and actually give some detailed proposal. Of course, you don't have one because you don't think like that, because you're not an international diplomat. You're not a foreign policy guru. You're a pretty crap businessman who's had 4 of his entities go bankrupt. Has been embroiled in, 3,000 court cases while he was president? 3,000. Like, the guy is not some genius who is going to be able to solve the Ukraine war and the issues with China and Russia like that unless it involves capitulating to those entities, which is, it appears, what he intends to do. The curtailment of intelligence under a possible future Trump administration was a topic of discussion at this week's NATO summit, according to the officials, as well as a senior US official. All of them were provided anonymity to discuss freely their thoughts about a second Trump administration. Reducing US intelligence sharing could reduce Europe's ability to withstand a Russian invasion should President Putin decide to expand military operations on the continent beyond Ukraine, a senior US official said. President Biden expanded the amount of intel the US shares, particularly related to Russia, with foreign allies. The European official said it is unclear whether the Trump administration is considering returning to the previous level of intel sharing or cutting back further. Concerns about Trump's plans if he wins re-election come as NATO ramps up efforts to gather evidence about suspected acts of sabotage, including arson linked to Russia across Europe. Quote, Russia right now, they're committing actual acts of arson and sabotage and planning assassinations on Allied soil, all in an effort to undermine support for Ukraine amongst our domestic populations, a senior NATO official said. The US has increased intelligence sharing within NATO in order to help support the response to these sabotage campaigns, and that's having a real impact. The US has always shared certain information with its allies to, for example, help them prepare for a potential terror attack or to help the alliance bolster itself against an immediate military threat. During Trump's first term, his intelligence officials toed the line, sharing intelligence with its closest security partners, including those in the Five Eyes alliance. That's Canada, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand. It did not go above and beyond what was required or custom, though. The Biden administration has taken that responsibility to a new level, devising a strategy to bolster its intelligence collection on Russia and to share that intelligence widely with its allies across the globe. It has shared sensitive intelligence with allies in cables and diplomatic conversations across the globe, including in Africa, and in briefings between top intelligence leaders and their counterparts. Quote, intelligence sharing among NATO members and with Ukraine has been absolutely essential to counter Russia's military aggression against the Ukraine, as well as to uncover and thwart other destabilizing Russian activities in Europe and beyond, and said John Brennan, former CIA director. A cutoff or significant scaling back of US intelligence sharing with NATO allies and partners would have an immediate, profound, and potentially long-lasting adverse impact on Western security interests. The Biden administration's increased intelligence sharing has also been part of a broader strategy to try and counter Russian influence and military might in corners of the globe where the US has traditionally dominated, including countries in Africa. So it's the idea that you step back from that, you step back from the world. It's again this like complete isolationism that is insanely dangerous, not just for the world, not just for global security, not just for global economic stability, but also for the US itself. The US, it will be stepping back from its influence roles in the world, and it will not be able to garner the return on investment from those influence operations. It would just become some kind of little Americana version of itself, a shadow of its former self. This is really, really scary. So anyway, the article goes on to spell out the woes of such a retreat from the international intelligence community in which it works. And then you have, at the same time, all of these things coming together. We have Senator Josh Hawley, who is pro-Russian, right? Let's face it. As Jay and Kiev says, Putin's third favourite senator responds to Russia's blowing up of a hospital full of kids by saying it's time to cut Ukraine's air defences. Whatever Russians have on this guy, it's good. So you've got Senator Josh Hawley's just sent a letter essentially saying, well, now's the time to cut air defences. Oh, what? That children's hospital has just been struck by Russian missiles that could have been shot down by better air defense coverage. Yeah, let's cut the air defenses so that that can happen more. Because that's the right moral thing to do. That's the right political thing to do, isn't it? And then, again, let's look at the broader picture being painted here and the long-term influence operations that Russia has been perpetrating. I'm saying let's go back further than the 2016 US election, the 2020 election, 2016 election that the Russian social media entities got involved in. Let's go back further than the Brexit referendum that they also got involved in. And let's go back as far as maybe 20 years to see the long-term strategies going on here. What's happened? Well, it turns out that, as the Daily Beast reports, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who is one of these very pro immunity for the US president, exactly like Putin got in 2020 from his own government. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas has been accused of not disclosing a yacht trip to Russia and a private helicopter flight to a palace in President Vladimir Putin's hometown, among a slew of other gifts and loans from businessman Harlan Crow. Buried on page 14 of a letter that two Democratic senators sent to Attorney General Merrick Garland on Tuesday, in which they urged Garland to appoint a special counsel to probe Thomas, was an astonishing list of dozens of likely undisclosed gifts and income from Crow's affiliated companies, and, quote, other donors. Just absolutely unbelievable. In the letter, Senators Sheldon Whitehouse, have got a lot of time for him, by the way, and Ron Wyden said Thomas, one of the court's staunchly conservative justices, even may have committed tax fraud and violated other federal laws by secretly accepting gifts and income potentially worth millions. Quote, the Senate is not a prosecutorial body, and the Supreme Court has no fact-finding function of its own, making the executive role all the more important if there is ever to be any complete determination of the facts, reads a letter requesting the appointment of a special prosecutor. We do not make this request lightly, said the letter. Now, there's a problem that there are no checks and balances. This is why there have been people calling for a reform of the Supreme Court, because there are no checks and balances for the Supreme Court, it appears, or at least there are very few avenues for that. But it's just, again, when you start piecing all these bits of the jigsaw together, it just looks like trouble for the US in terms of its positioning vis-a-vis Russia and China. And all this is happening on the day that what has happened? So today, a new record, the largest Chinese single-day violation of Taiwan's air defense zone, ADIZ, ever recorded. 66 Chinese aircraft were detected around the island. 56 crossed the ADIZ and came as close as 33 nautical miles. 66 aircraft detected flying around Taiwan. Military aircraft. And then here's a thread, unraveling that. Look at what is happening around the Philippines with the Chinese fleet that I talked to you about the other day. China's moved significant firepower and naval assets into the South and East China Seas. For the first time, Beijing conducted drills within the Philippines EEZ and deployed the Shandong carrier group to nearby waters. Premier surface competence and amphibious warships are also underway. I mean, this is all incredibly worrying. And what's happening in the political domain in the US is that the US is gifting China and Russia greater and greater ability to do things like this. So if you're one of the maybe Republican politicians who says, well, we should be concentrating more on China rather than Ukraine, China is looking at Ukraine and is learning from Ukraine. Right? You want to be strong on China, you are strong on Russia. You are strong in your support of Ukraine. China is just learning that the US doesn't have the balls, and it doesn't have the balls because many of the politicians are in the Trumpian wing are doing the bidding of both Russia and China. Now, how do you deal with all this information if you are someone who really supports Trump? You have to deal with this. You're either going to say, I'm biased, I'm a liberal lefty, or I'm lying, or these are lies, these aren't true. Or if you can't say they're not true, if the facts are so obviously in your face that these are true, then they have to be right. That Trump is making the right decision in eschewing European intelligence agencies, in degrading support for Ukraine, in fact, turning off support for Ukraine must be the right thing to do. Because it's what he's going to do, and he's your man. Don't be beholden to the man because you then become a member of a cult. Be beholden to ideas and the right thing to do, irrespective of what that person says, because you've made the moral evaluation and you've made the political evaluation based on decent evidence. Good stuff in, good stuff out. Not garbage in, garbage out. Not this prejudged ideal that whatever this guy does is by default correct and right and proper. And he can do things that you like elsewhere, but you have to admit, or be prepared to admit, that what he does in a certain domain might well be wrong. The world is at an inflection point at the moment, and there are really significant Limburgian elements of the US, isolationist elements, that wants the US to bury its head in the sand and allow World War III to go the route that World War II didn't, precisely because the US got involved in the right way. This is too important to get wrong. November is too important to get wrong. I'd rather vote for a dead body if I had a chance to vote in that election than for Trump. For reasons like this. As weak as Biden is, and he is weaker than he should be by a country mile. As weak as he is, he's still almost infinitely better than Trump. But my goodness, there needs to be someone better than him. There needs to be some strength in that Biden administration, whereby the US is ready to stand up for what is right in their own self-interest as well as what is morally right. I feel a tinge, more than a tinge. I feel a pang, and it's growing, a pang of despair.